reviewing the scientific literature to answer your questions about gender diversity. This is Classroom Psychology. And now here's your host, Dr. Cora Sargent. Hello everybody and welcome to Classroom Psychology. I'm your host Cora. Thank you so very much for joining me. It is wonderful to see you, get on in here and let's talk about gender diversity some more. And this week, as we do every time we come together, this little community of ours, we take a question framed as they often are in the form of confident declaration, but we take it for the question that we know it was intended to be, and we look to the scientific literature to see if we can't find an answer. And this week, our question comes from Member of Parliament for Penistone and Stockbridge, Miriam Cates. So let's hear from her. We actually have two quotes from her, one from last year and one from just a couple of weeks ago. Last year, she was engaging in a parliamentary debate on the legal recognition for non-binary people. So this is Member of Parliament for Penistone and Stockbridge, the Right Honourable Miriam Cates.
The evidence is pretty clear that a disproportionate number of children who identify as trans and non-binary are autistic, have been diagnosed as autistic, and many more are awaiting diagnosis. There is a very clear link between children who are neurodiverse and children who are choosing to go down this path. Does she not think that that in itself is of a concern, and that those children should be surrounded with safeguarding support?
And once again, more recently, within the last couple of weeks on GB News, Miriam Cates.
The best way to keep a child safe is to maintain their relationship with their parents. I mean, that's absolutely true. It's the first rule of safeguarding. And so it is wrong that schools have been concealing these safeguarding issues from parents. And don't forget, if a child does reveal, let's say that they have discomfort with their body, that is a safeguarding red flag, because so often these feelings come with many other conditions. Autism, children experience bullying or abuse. They are things that need to be investigated, not just accepted, and so of course parents should be involved.
Thanks so much to the Right Honourable Miriam Cates for such an interesting question posed, as they often are, in the form of confident declaration. Now, obviously, Miriam Cates most recently talking about the school's guidance, which is about a week or so away from being published, for those who don't know. I know that we've talked about it briefly on this podcast before, but we're on the edge of schools' guidance being published about how schools can work with gender diverse folk and how they can support gender diverse children and young people, including those who are questioning. And it looks very much like it's going to include outing children to their parents when they are questioning. We covered that in another episode. Here, though, Miriam Cates' question is really about the intersection between gender diversity and neurodiversity, particularly autism. The question seems to be, is the neurodiverse population overrepresented in the gender diverse population, and is the gender diverse population, conversely, overrepresented in the neurodiverse population? Given the frequency with which people experience those two identities, is the overlap, the intersection of those two experiences bigger than one would expect given the size of those populations? This is a reasonable question. And then there's a reasonable question about why that might be the case. And to put this in a bit of a social context, you may have even heard it actually in Right Honourable Miriam Cates' question. We know from intersectional psychology that people who experience multiple marginalized identities often have experiences, at the intersection of those identities where the sort of experience of marginalization is greater than the sum of its parts, right? It's not just the experience of marginalization in terms of gender diversity and marginalization in terms of neurodiversity, but the experience at that intersection is going to have overlapping and compounding effects of marginalization, experiences of marginalization. And one of the reasons here is because it offers an opportunity for people to call into question the identities of people at that intersection, right? Folks who experience themselves being neurodiverse and gender diverse. I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that those folks are any less able to know themselves, to know their identities than anybody else, right? But it seems that the overrepresentation offers an opportunity for folks to claim for sure that people at that intersection can't necessarily know themselves in the way that other people do, which is surely just pure marginalization and discrimination. But what we want to do here is to take a look at the question, is there really an overrepresentation in one another's communities? And why might that be the case? Brilliantly, there's a series of systematic reviews in this field that have just come out in the last few years that try to answer these questions. And at the core of them is the legendary Rubes Walsh, who is one of my favorite writers right now. Absolutely brilliant scientist. So, let's take a look, see if we can't find an answer together. So just a quick note about terminology here. We're going to try and use, as much as I can, identity first language. I know that some people prefer person first language, but we have to make a choice. We can't do both. So I'm going to attempt to use identity first language as much as I can. But the language of the research is definitely pathologizing in nature. So we talk about autism spectrum disorder, and we talk about gender identity disorder, because this is the language of the terminology of the assessments and of like the ICD-10 and of the DSM-5, the sort of diagnostic and statistical manuals that researchers use to give some kind of robust determination as to whom is at this intersection and whom isn't. It's not a perfect system, and the pathologizing language isn't ideal, but it is simply the case. So we're going to use it when I'm referring to these studies, but I will try and endeavor to use identity first language as much as I can. Now, the other thing that I need to say is that this field is full of a diverse range of papers that look at very different things under the banner of looking at this intersection. So the first question is, who do you include in gender diverse populations when you're talking about this intersection? Is it everybody that's been referred into gender identity clinics? Well, we know that actually the majority of folk who consider themselves gender diverse don't go into gender identity clinics necessarily, right? Or don't have access to gender identity clinics or gender identity development services. So actually, maybe that's not ideal, but those who are referred in, not all of those folk are actually gender diverse, and not all of those folk are like diagnosed with gender dysphoria in inverted commas. So we have a bit of a problem, right? Do we just consider those diagnosed with gender dysphoria? Do we consider those who are referred into gender clinics? Do we consider those who would self-identify as gender diverse? All of those different ways of doing things yield extremely different results in terms of identifying, are these two populations overrepresented? And again, the same thing around the neurodiverse cohort, right? Do we include people who self-identify as neurodiverse? Some cool research at the university with Henry Wood Downey. Shout out to friend and colleague Henry, who has been, advocating for trying to maybe question whether the medical diagnosis is a good benchmark for entry to this population. We find that maybe it's not, maybe people who self-identify might not differ from those with a diagnosis in a lot of meaningful ways. So do we include people who self-identify, or just those with a diagnosis in inverted commas? But then we're only including people who have access to diagnosis, which, in itself can be seen as a sort of a consequence of privilege. Do we include people who experience neurodiverse traits? Like, we have a lot of kind of autistic traits research where people are sort of screened for traits of people who are otherwise members of neurodiverse communities, but don't necessarily self-identify. So, whom do we consider members of these communities is actually not an easy question to answer, and the research is really diverse in its answering of those questions. That can make it very difficult to see what's really going on here. But we'll do our best to try and make sense of it for you. And we're going to start our journey with the legendary Thrower and colleagues in 2020, Prevalence of Autism Spectrum Disorder and Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder Among Individuals with Gender Dysphoria, a systematic review. And talking about terminology, for sure. Right from the beginning in the title, pathologizing language. Apologies. Let's take a look. So they reviewed 30 papers in the field, which is really cool. And they cite that, the first thing to say is that the range of representation in one another's communities, or how many gender diverse folk are there in the sort of neurodiverse population, and how many neurodiverse folk are there in the gender diverse population. Those are the questions that this research aimed to answer, this big systematic review. The challenge is that the sort of proportions range drastically, and the reason is because it really depends on whom you consider members of each community. Is it about self-identification? Is it about attendance to medical services? Is it about like diagnoses discretely? So let's start with the gender diverse population. Are neurodiverse people overrepresented in the gender diverse population? Otherwise put, what proportion of folks attending gender diversity clinics are also neurodiverse, particularly with regards to autism in this case, right? So we find that in 3 studies from Kaltiala, Haino, Leaf, and Nahata, 3 separate studies in 2015, 2019, and 2017, respectively, we find that it ranges from 5% to 26% of children and adolescents referred into gender clinics also having a past diagnosis of ASD, autism spectrum disorder. Now, if we're going to look at folks who are diagnosed with gender dysphoria, not just those who are referred into gender identity development services, we need to look to the work of De Vries and colleagues in 2010. Now, they had a look at just over 200 children and adolescents referred into the gender identity clinic in the Netherlands. And they gave those young people standardized assessments to have a look to see, do they have gender dysphoria and do they have autism, essentially. They were looking at suspected autism rather than a discrete diagnosis, but they used a standardized assessment called the DISCO-10, the Diagnostic Interview for Social and Communication Disorders. So it's probably, it's probably as good a tool as you can use to at least give you some kind of standardized sense of where people lie. Now, they found that of the people referred into the service, only 63% were diagnosed with gender dysphoria, and of those, 52 were children and 77 were adolescents. And those with gender dysphoria who were children, around 1.9% had ASD, and those adolescents, of 77 adolescents, 6.5% had ASD. We're talking about very small numbers here. It's only 1 child with ASD and 5 adolescents with ASD, so it's quite small numbers. But again, we are finding this kind of overrepresentation. We wouldn't necessarily expect it, even when we're looking at discretely those with a gender dysphoria diagnosis and those who score highly in the kind of clinical, in inverted commas, range on the diagnostic interview for social and communication disorders. Even when we look at that sort of discrete overlap between those very clinical populations, we still find this 1.9%, 6.5%, which is definitely higher than the 0.6% to 1% in the general population. So far we've taken a look at the question, of gender diverse folk, what proportion of those folk are also neurodiverse? If we flip that on its head and take a look at neurodiversity and see what proportion of that population are gender diverse, we need to take a look at Hisley Gorman and colleagues' study in 2019. Theirs was titled Gender Dysphoria in Children with Autism Spectrum Disorder. Now, these guys were looking specifically at children. It's actually a really cool study. They took a look at 48,762 children, and they tracked them from a mean age of 1.3 to a mean age of 8.83. So they tracked them for like a long time. And they matched them to 5 controls each. So a control group of just shy of 300,000 children. And they looked at the mental health support and care that these individuals received over that time. Now, what they could do was identify how many of those 48,762 children had an ASD diagnosis, and then have a look at, of those children, how many were diagnosed with gender dysphoria at some point. So what they found was, as we say, there were, of those just shy of 300,000 children, 48,762 were diagnosed with ASD. And then they were able to take a look at the proportion that were diagnosed with gender dysphoria. And of those children, 66 were diagnosed with gender dysphoria, bearing in mind that gender dysphoria diagnoses generally tend to happen in adolescence. At least they're more frequently happening in adolescence. So these kids, not very many of them. That's a rate of 0.02%. So that's not very many, but it's still 4 times higher than the rate in the general population of the sample. So there is this kind of overrepresentation. it's not necessarily massive, and particularly if you take a look at the question from the perspective of like how many of the neurodiverse population also experience gender dysphoria, it's actually not very many. It's only about 4 times higher than the general population, but it's still a bit of an overrepresentation. And if we take a look at it from the other direction, when we look at the like gender diverse population, how many of those folk are also neurodiverse, the rate is much higher. And it looks like it's between 5 and 26% of the population, particularly if you take those definitions quite broadly. So that's quite interesting, right? Like if we take a look at neurodiversity and gender diversity, there is an overrepresentation of each group in each other's population. There is like the Venn diagram of people who experience both is greater than you might expect given the prevalence of each in the population. Now, here comes the real question. Why might that be the case? Now, in order to answer this question, we need to go to the systematic review literature. I just love the systematic review literature so much. And we get to hear from Rubes Walsh, one of my favorite all-time people in this field. Wattle, Walsh, and Krabbendam, Theories on the Link Between Autism Spectrum Conditions and the Transgender Modality, a systematic review. This is really cool study. Now, they make a really good case, as I think we have done here, that they take a look at another couple of key studies. They take a look at Glidden and colleagues and Vanderlaan and colleagues, both kind of big studies and systematic reviews of gender dysphoria and autism spectrum disorder, in inverted commas, and the relationship between the two. And they make a good case that there is an overrepresentation here. The scope of that overrepresentation, as we've already described, is up for some debate, but there is some overrepresentation here. So they go into trying to understand why, and they take a look at the literature, a massive systematic review, 30 different studies included, and they go through trying to identify all of the different theories people have come up with for why there's this overrepresentation. Why is there a connection between these two things? And what's really interesting is that they come away with 2 really promising theories. Now, long story short, we don't know why there is this kind of connection between neurodiverse and gender diverse populations. We think there is one. We don't know why it's the case, but there are 2 theories that I really, really like in here. First of all, though, I want to kind of talk to you about all the different theories that there are, just to kind of give you a bit of an overview. And there are 15 different theories. So, there are quite a few. Whoa, we're going to go through them together in very brief detail, because most of them, all of the theories we're going to talk about, 13 of them, have some evidence for them, some evidence against them, and for a good few of them, they are just open theories with no evidence at all, just people pondering the possibility of why these 2 things might be connected. So we're going to go through those 13. I don't think any of them are particularly compelling cases, but they could play a role. It's possible they could play a role here. So we're going to cover them. 13 different theories. Then we're going to talk about the 2 that I really, really like that the authors consider are the most promising. Now, the first of these is birth weight. The theory goes, and there's one key study from Vanderlaan and colleagues in 2015 that seemed to find that people who are like gender diverse and those who are neurodiverse share a high birth weight. They seem to be like heavy kids when they're born compared to the general population. It's not massive. It's not like 15% heavier. It's not huge, but it is a little heavier. And nobody really knows why. While 4 studies review it and draw the attention to the possibility of birth weight, none can really explain the mechanism through which a higher birth weight might lead to these things, and like to neurodiversity or gender diversity. And honestly, you have to be quite careful with any correlational studies like this, because birth weight is also associated with a bunch of other both societal, systemic, and like within individual difference factors, which aren't birth weight. They're just connected to birth weight, which might better explain the relationship between what looks like a relationship between birth weight and neurodiversity and gender diversity. The second explanation is the extreme male brain theory. Now, what you're going to find here is that a lot of these theories really only explain half of the picture. They only explain why young people assigned female at birth might experience themselves to be both gender diverse and neurodiverse, right? Whereas it doesn't explain why that's the case for people assigned male at birth. Which, I mean, the authors here suggest is, only half of the picture and may limit the explanatory power of the theory. But nonetheless, extreme male brain theory is essentially an extension of the empathizing systematizing theory, which essentially says that people on the autistic spectrum have a diminished capacity for empathizing and stronger systematizing abilities, which is typical in sort of male folk and therefore might be an example of an extreme male, in inverted commas, brain. So those children, young people assigned female at birth, folks generally assigned female at birth who are neurodiverse, who are on the autistic spectrum, may have this kind of more extreme male brain, and that may make them therefore more likely to also experience themselves to be gender diverse, finding themselves more in the masculine end of the spectrum. The next theory is prenatal hormones, the idea that androgen exposure to the developing fetal brain can potentially influence the development of both neurodiversity and gender diversity. But once again, similarly, only offers something of an explanation for people assigned female at birth. Doesn't lead to any kind of explanation for those assigned male at birth. And the evidence for this one isn't particularly strong, with some studies finding an association between prenatal androgen levels and some studies not finding an association between prenatal androgen levels and ASC traits. And something that's also quite interesting here is that there's one study by Nobili in 2020 that found that people assigned female at birth who were gender diverse after their gender affirming hormone treatment showed more autistic spectrum sort of symptomatology, in inverted commas, more neurodiversity. The next theory is there might be genetic factors or epigenetic factors. For those who don't know, epigenetics is the study of how genes are expressed. So while you might inherit your genes, genes can be turned on or off by environmental stimuli, and then those sort of that activation or deactivation of particular genes can then be passed on to your children. Epigenetic heritage is a thing. So genetic or epigenetic factors may play a role here. It's a theory that's out there, but not a particularly strong evidence base behind it. The next is gender development. So gender development is a task of childhood, quite possibly a developmental task, much like other developmental tasks. And like other developmental tasks, gender development could be something that can be delayed or unusual. So people who are neurodiverse might experience a level of difference in their gender development, and that might then trigger kind of both neurodiversity and gender diversity, or at least increase the chance of experiencing some gender diversity. Again, not a huge evidence base behind this theory. Zucker found a developmental lag of gender constancy, which is the ability to identify that gender doesn't change over time or with settings and situations. And he found that there was a lag in gender constancy in children who were experiencing gender dysphoria referred into the clinic. But you might expect that to be the case in children who are gender diverse, right? Like gender constancy just isn't necessarily as much the case for gender diverse children, so I might explain some of that. Kalitsanaki also found the same thing, and then Cooper et al. Basically identified that the ability to self-categorize, differences in the ability to self-categorize for people who are neurodiverse might then lead to challenges or at least differences in gender identity development. Again, not the strongest theory, I would say, in here, but just one of the potential triggers of this link. The next is obsessions. Of course, like part of being gender diverse can be a sort of focus on the rules and norms of a gender different to the one that you were assigned at birth, and in the effort to sort of adhere to the social norms of that experience, people can become quite focused on them and that, in inverted commas, obsession can then lead to, or at least be considered, a part of an autistic spectrum experience. Equally, people suggesting the other way around might be possible, that obsessions as an established trait of autism might then kind of lead to people to become obsessed with things, interests or behaviors that are typically associated with a different gender to the one you've been assigned. So obsessions might explain this link. While there is some evidence to link these two things, like intense interests in intense cross-gender interests might be the way to describe this. Like, that could be a link between these two things. But Van der Meesen and colleagues are saying, actually, we found all ASC, like autism spectrum continuum subdomains, were elevated in gender diverse folk, not just the intense interests component. So it probably is more than just like this obsessions in inverted commas connection. The next theory that might try to explain this link is rigidity, the argument that part of neurodiversity when it comes to autism is potentially a cognitive inflexibility, and there may be an inflexibility then when it comes to gendered norms and roles. Therefore, this is what boys do, this is what girls do. I feel different to typical boys, therefore maybe I'm gender diverse. That might be an explanatory link, but there's no evidence for it, and there's 3 papers against that link. Basically, that none of them found an association between the kind of gender diverse community and the autistic traits associated with rigidity. Fascinating stuff. But still, it's a theory that's out there. Very, very weak evidence for that. Sensory processing is the next. And again, not particularly strong relationship between sensory processing and this intersection. But there's a theory that a lot of gendered experiences are sensory experiences, whether it become, clothes, whether it be glitter, whether it be, the wearing of makeup, whether it be the kind of engagement in sports. These can be gendered experiences typically. I'm not suggesting they should be by any means, but they can be. And therefore, maybe sensory processing differences might lead people to associate with a different gender to the one that they were assigned at birth. Again, very weak evidence here for this connection. The next is sexual orientation, and the argument that, again, with like a rigidity of thinking, that perhaps people might mistake their sort of sexual orientation as outside of the norm for gender diversity. Again, like I take issue with some of these theories generally. This kind of assumes that people can't tell the difference, which I think is a bit of a startling assertion. Now, the next theory is about theory of mind and mentalizing. Now, this one has more truck, I think. This one's got a bit of evidence behind it. Doesn't seem to be any evidence countering it, so it might be one of the explanations. And actually, it may actually be connected to a better explanation, which is a resistance to social norms, which we'll come to. So the theory goes that people who are neurodiverse find it hard to mentalize, to identify somebody else's perspective, to take this perspective of the other, to be able to understand that other people have different thoughts and beliefs and understandings and knowledge to yourself. That's also termed theory of mind, that latter bit there. And the point is that if you are less able to identify, if you're less able to mentalize, then you're less able to identify and follow the social norms and rules of your environment. And those social norms and rules can be gendered, right? Some of them are gendered social rules and norms. So what's interesting is this theory goes that people who are neurodiverse are therefore inherently more resistant to gendered norms. Now, this is really interesting to me because it's sort of, sometimes you'll hear the kind of explanation, you'll hear the sort of concern that, well, neurodiverse folk are more prone to social contagion, and therefore maybe, there's no evidence for this, by the way, but maybe that therefore they need protection from learning about gender diversity because they're more likely to become gender diverse as a consequence. But what the theory of mind mentalizing hypothesis here and the resistance to social norm hypothesis, one is the sort of neurological part, one is the social part. what this hypothesis kind of says is that quite the opposite might be the case, that people who are neurodiverse are more resistant to social norms. They develop in absence of those social norms. And so there's a beautiful study called I Don't Feel Like a Gender, I Feel Like Myself, which looks to gender diverse folk and their experience of gender diversity in the context of being neurodiverse. And they describe this very thing, that they develop as themselves. Their identity is just less connected to and driven by gendered norms and rules. So that's really interesting. So this one has a bit more truck. We're going to come back to this in a minute because it's the theory goes a little bit deeper and some of the work is really fascinating. So we'll talk about it in a second. The next theory is about feeling different. And this one kind of goes in two flavors. In basically, on the one hand, the sense that, part of being neurodiverse is a sense of feeling different to other people. And so it's possible that given that people feel different, they might have a sense that they are gender diverse, which might help to explain that feeling of difference. Alternatively, might be the other way around, that people who experience feeling different because of gender diversity may have that interpreted by professionals as a symptom of ASC, autism, essentially. So yeah, again, not particularly strong evidence here, but just a theory. Then minority stress. Now, this theory goes that for trans people, the experience of minority stress may create a context in which you might then experience social difficulties as a consequence, right? So minority stress theory, an amazing theory by Ilan Meyer, and it essentially says that if you experience the stress of marginalization, that's going to have a number of psychological and social and even physical negative outcomes as a consequence. So the theory goes that you might be more likely to develop the social difficulties that might otherwise be associated with neurodiversity by virtue of the minority stress triggered by your gender diversity. But there's not really good evidence for that, I think. While absolutely it can cause social difficulties, I think stretching it to the argument that it triggers kind of all of the symptomatology associated with neurodiversity is a bit too much of a stretch, and there's evidence against it. And certainly, though, it does look like the experience of minority stress at this intersection is obviously the double whammy of being marginalized because of your gender diversity and marginalized because of your neurodiversity. So the evidence against this theory comes from Nobili in 2020, who basically found that people's autism questionnaires that they were using to identify people as on the autism spectrum remained stable both before and after gender affirming treatment, even though, arguably people's minority stress might have alleviated somewhat as a consequence of good gender affirming treatment. Although, again, that's a little bit of a stretch even in and of itself. Again, interesting theory, probably doesn't lend too much of explanatory power. The last that I want to talk about here, before we get onto the really strong explanations, is social communication. So the theory with social communication goes that the inherent challenges of social communication that come with neurodiversity in terms of autism specifically results in a challenge in understanding gender norms, which might therefore lead to a greater chance of experiencing yourself to be gender diverse. Again, not great evidence for this one either. And Nabijan looked at the relationship between people who between gender diversity and the propensity to seek out and engage in social interactions. And this theory would suggest that people who were gender diverse would therefore be less likely to seek out and engage in social interactions, and he found that they weren't. So it's unlikely, I guess, that social communication challenges are a good explanatory factor for this intersection. So there are two really good factors in here. Walsh and colleagues highlight that there are a bunch that we've already talked about, most of which have got either very weak or sort of contradictory evidence associated with them. But there are two that the authors consider are promising. I've got to say, I back them both as well. Having read through all of this work myself, it's took forever. I got to say that I'm compelled by these two arguments. And the first of these, I had to go and look up a bunch of times. I had to go back to the original authors and read their work a bunch of times to understand exactly what was being argued here, because I thought I misunderstood it, and I didn't. And it actually makes perfect sense. It's called weakened sex differences. So the point is that if we talk about transgender and gender diverse young people, and we talk about men and women, right? When a lot of this work, a lot of the research and a lot of the kind of the way of thinking about these young people thinks of transgender boys, i.e. those identifying as boys in the world, as essentially girls in the literature, right? It says they were assigned female at birth, and therefore they're sort of pocketed in the female category. If we take a look at their autism symptomology, for example, we take a look at neurodiversity and the features of neurodiversity, we think of them as typical girls instead of thinking of them as typical boys. Likewise, for transgender girls who identify as girls in the world and who were assigned male at birth, we think of them in the literature in most of the work as typical boys. And we look to the autism traits and we look to the sort of the characteristics of neurodiversity of typical boys when we think about them. And the research here by people like Vermaat, Van der Meesen, Beecher, and Khaled, Sunaki, and Williams challenges this and basically says we need to think about these young people in quite the opposite way. What Vermaat finds is that children assigned female at birth had similar autism quotient scores, this sort of 50 question questionnaire that's given to young people. They find that trans folk assigned female at birth had similar autism quotient scores to neurotypical males, right? They find that people assigned female at birth who identify as men in the world essentially function like men in the world when it comes to their neurotypical or autism spectrum traits. The same for trans people assigned male at birth. They have similar AQ scores to neurotypical females. And this connects, right? I was reading this, I was like, well, obviously they do. We've talked about, the legendary work of colleagues like Christina Olsen, like Celine Gilgos, looking at kind of saying essentially that people who identify as girls essentially are girls in the world in all the ways that matter. And we find here that actually that's the case too, that actually we should maybe just consider these, assigned female at birth who identify as boys in the world, think of them more as boys, and actually we can see that their sort of AQ scores are a bit more typical of other boys. Now, here's something that's really interesting. So the weakened sex differences theory goes one step further, and there's this really interesting study by Beecher in 2012. Now, Beecher took 60 brains of people who were neurodiverse and took a look at functional MRI imaging, and they were looking for the kind of typical sex differences that you'd see in the different areas of the brain. Now, there are a bunch like total white matter volume, regional gray matter volume, particularly in the right parietal operculum. They looked at fractional antiostropy in the body of the cingulate gyrus and the cingulum, and a bunch of other things, basically. Now, there is typically some difference between men and women in these areas, and they found that those differences were much less pronounced in these kind of neurodiverse folk, which might give some explanation, like what makes people neurodiverse, at least in part, might also make them more likely to be gender diverse. There may just literally be a genuine overlap in these communities, that is more to do with brain differences than it is to do with anything else. Now, we do need to be slightly careful here, because it's very easy to think, well, brain differences are born, not made. But it is possible, of course, for brain structures to change as a consequence of experience. So we've got to be a little bit careful about looking at the causality here. But for sure, it's a fascinating theory that neurodiversity may feature brain differences that literally make people more likely to be gender diverse. Now, the last theory in here, which I find super interesting, it's one of the ones that shows most promise, is described as a resistance to social norms. Now, the theory proposes that gender diversity is more common among neurodiverse folk because they are inherently less susceptible to the societal pressures and norms and rules than neurotypical people. In other words, it basically says that autistic folk are free from the normative influences when forming their gender identities. So when they're very little and they're developing, they don't see and aren't influenced. And maybe they don't see, but maybe they're just not influenced by, maybe they're resistant to the social and societal pressures that are often applied to people from cisgender normative society, right? We have very heavy rules around what boys can do, what girls can do. And if people who are neurodiverse are more resistant to those norms, then perhaps they develop more in absence of those norms and develop, in a sense, just less inhibited by, less affected by the social rules and norms of gendered society. Now, here's something that's really cool. There's this really cool article by Rubes Walsh, again, huge fan. If I ever see you in person, I'm just going to pass out at your feet. Walsh and colleagues very recently, 2018, talking about essentially bringing together people who experience themselves to be neurodiverse, to experience themselves to be on the autistic spectrum. And they took a look at basically the autistic experiences of those folk and the gender experiences of those folk. Now, right at the beginning, do you remember when we were looking at the relationship, the overlap between these communities? And we found that people referred into like gender, like medical services for like gender identity development services, for example. When we look at those people referred in, actually a lot more of those were sort of on the autistic spectrum than those who were kind of more discreetly transgender, those who were more like who had been diagnosed with gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder, where the rate was a little lower. Well, Rubes Walsh might be able to explain what's happening here. So Rubes took a look at quite a lot, 669 participants, 322 of which were assigned male at birth, 347 of which were assigned female at birth, and all of them were like diagnosed with being on the autism continuum, essentially. And the mean age was 44 years. And they basically asked them a bunch of questions about their experience. And here's what's interesting. They found that very few identified as binarily trans, right? Very, very few. And far more identified as non-binary. So only 6 participants identified as like binary trans, whereas many, many more identified themselves as non-binary. In fact, while only 6 identified as like binarily trans, nearly 100, that's 94, identified as non-binary. So you had this really big spike in non-binary identities. And what gets really interesting is that the scores on the AQ, we described the autism quotient questionnaire, 50 questions given to people. The scores on the AQ were highest, most elevated for people at that in that non-binary space who identified as non-binary. Now, this is super fascinating, right? It's possible that we have this group here who experience themselves like in complete resistance to the social and gendered norms of their environment, who don't feel like a gender, but rather feel like themselves. Now, there's a really cool study that I want to introduce you to. It's by Corti and colleagues. It was published in Autism in Adulthood in 2018. It's called I Don't Feel Like a Gender, I Feel Like Myself. And Corti brought together a bunch of people sort of who identified as girls, who were raised as girls in the world, and asked them about their gender. Now, the emancipatory nature of the work meant that participants raised gender identity as spontaneously as important to them and understanding themselves. But an absence of gender identity rather than gender identity in the main. They identified themselves quite oftenly as separate to the gendered experiences of the people around them. Here's a quote from one participant that I thought you might really like. This is from Taylor. "My sense of identity is fluid, just as my sense of gender is fluid. The only constant identity that runs through my life as a thread is dancer. This is more important to me than gender, name, or any other identifying features, even more important than mother. I wouldn't admit that in the neurotypical world, as when I've been corrected. After all, mother is supposed to be my primary identification, right? But I feel that I can admit that here. It's super cool to me. And basically the theme of this research is that, people on the autism spectrum can have a strong resistance to the social norms of environments, including gender norms. And as they find a sense of identification, as they find who they are in the world, sometimes their identity is just separate from their understanding of gender. They don't necessarily feel like a gender, they just feel like themselves. And I find that to be a wonderful explanation. This is Rubes Walsh's notion of autistic resistance. Just being in the world as yourself sometimes resists the gendered norms and expectations of cisnormative society. But that isn't a problem with the individual, that's a problem with cisnormative society. Those expectations are problematic, and the fact that people are resistant to those expectations is actually maybe a beautiful thing. We shouldn't be trying to pull people into our expectations of what men and women should be in the world. We should just help people to understand who they are in the world as separate to that, and help them to embody whatever makes them most comfortable in the world. If we do that, if we can create a world where maybe we just kind of put aside the gendered norms and expectations, if people don't necessarily identify with them, then we can create a world where everyone can find a place to truly belong. Thanks so very much for joining me. This is Classroom Psychology. You are very, very welcome here, and I look forward to seeing you, as always, in the next one.